Hello, everyone. I'm Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, we've learned a lot about the city over the last couple of weeks. There was a newspaper series that showed the changing demographics of the area, and a New York Times article that marveled at the local restaurant boom and what it means. We'll take a look at both tonight, as well as the swearing in of a new U.S. attorney, David Vitter's future, and a council member retires. Our Future Watch segment revisits the emerging hospital complex. And feeling the pulse for us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol, Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Gordon Russell, managing editor of Investigations, The New Orleans Advocate. Don Ostrom, Channel 12's Future Watch reporter. And Stephanie Grace, columnist, The New Orleans Advocate. We're first off over to Gordon. And Gordon, you at The New Orleans Advocate did a comprehensive series, multi-part series about the New Orleans metro region post-Katrina, the region redefined. Tell us some of the things that you have discovered about our region.
Well, we tried to take a look at the long term and then the shorter term since Katrina too, and kind of the premise was kind of that New Orleans had been on this long-term decline. Most geographers and experts had agreed they had grouped us with places like Cleveland and Pittsburgh and St. Louis, these kind of cities that were post-industrial, often located in the Rust Belt, cities that were kind of just sliding. Yeah. We looked at whether that narrative had changed somewhat after Katrina, and then some of the specific trends that we're seeing in the area. And it sort of was open-ended, I think, in terms of whether we've changed the narrative and whether we're no longer seen as a Cleveland, but as a Nashville or an Austin. But there are some signs of those kinds of things, as well as some serious challenges too. So we kind of broke it up into parts, and we've had a story about areas of the city that have been rediscovered and gentrified, especially the sliver along by the river, where you're seeing real estate prices really go through the roof and lots of renovations. There's still parts of the city that are really challenged by blight and depopulation, especially areas that were flooded, but also some areas that weren't flooded. And then we're also seeing some things, and some of these are mirror national trends. We're seeing more poverty move into the suburbs, Jefferson Parish in particular, and then Slidell have a much larger percentage of poor people than they used to. And some of that is people moving out after Katrina, but some of it is not really related to that. And then we looked at a lot of the jobs have moved out of the city into the suburbs as well. And then the last part we looked at was sort of this real boom in the Latino population, which is really a post-Katrina phenomenon, with all these people moving in to work in the reconstruction, but then many of them staying, permanently.
We should say also that you did this in partnership with the Greater New Orleans Community Data Center, which really looks at this scientifically and statistically and really crunches the numbers about who's going where and who's doing what.
Right. It was a great partnership. They sort of analyzed all the numbers for us and helped us sort of see what the trends were, and then we went out and sort of did the reporting to tell the story of what was happening.
So tell us about the population. I mean, we know that the population certainly has shifted. We've seen a drop in Orleans Parish population. We saw a real boom in St. Tammany Parish population. What is this really sort of telling us about settlement patterns and also the socioeconomic balance of everything?
I mean, some of this it can be seen in the context of things that were going on before Katrina, where people were moving out. You had decades of the city losing population, and in some ways that's just continued, although right now we're actually gaining population in the city as areas still recover. But, if you look at the long term, the city has lost population to the suburbs, and that's kind of in keeping with a lot of national trends, although there is this kind of counter trend of rediscovering the city, a lot of young people moving in, and kids who grew up in the suburbs often moving into the city and deciding they prefer it.
And young entrepreneurs moving in too. Is that something that you did see to actually be a fact? We hear about this anecdotally. It seems to be true. Is this what you discovered?
Yeah, I mean, the data center has some data showing that we have, New Orleans has a higher entrepreneurship. They have a way of counting it through business starts and other things like that. Now, we haven't become a greatly successful hub of entrepreneurship in the way that like a Silicon Valley has. I mean, we're talking, I think, in a lot of cases about very small startups, restaurants, and so on, like the New York Times story you mentioned. But there is a lot of youthful energy here, I think you could say.
But, another important trend, I know this is going on in all cities, but I think it's happening better in New Orleans, is people moving into downtown areas and in warehouse district areas and old abandoned buildings that are being converted into residential areas, and that's a really encouraging scene in New Orleans.
Right, I mean, the fastest growing part of the city in recent decades has been the downtown and the warehouse district, which had almost no people and now has, 5,000 people maybe or something. And you've got a Rouse's supermarket down the street, and it's sort of, and we work down there, and you can really see the
people walking their dogs and carrying
and you
their
can
groceries.
see the condo conversion projects are happening all the time, all around you.
But does this spell gentrification? And with that, sometimes there's a negativity to it.
Well, sure. I mean, there's gentrification is a double-edged sword. I mean, the city has never had a great tax base, and I think to some extent adding more of a tax base is a good thing and makes the government more able to do things and stabilizes those things. But obviously it can hurt renters when rents go up and they're priced out of neighborhoods. It can hurt homeowners if they can't afford the taxes. There's a freeze for elderly people on your taxes if you're 65 years or older. There's some other things like that, but it can obviously be detrimental to those people. I should say too that a lot of people, it's in some cases it can be a boon if you're a poor person but you own a house in a neighborhood that gentrifies and you sell the house for a big profit. It's something I've seen in my neighborhood fairly regularly. That's perhaps a positive effect also, though you may end up not living in the neighborhood anymore.
And we've seen jobs move more to Jefferson Parish, but Jefferson also has experiencing greater urban ills too, what had been considered the urban ills.
Right. I think, in some ways Jefferson Parish is becoming more like the city than it was in terms of its demographics. I mean, Jefferson Parish initially was, is sort of an outgrowth of white flight almost in the 60s when, school desegregation and all these things, suburbanization, a lot of different government actions led a lot of people to move to Jefferson Parish. And now Jefferson Parish is much more diverse than it used to be. It's got a lot more poor people than it used to have. Actually, the most diverse census tract in the whole region is in Fat City. So
I remember
interesting to see what changes go there.
When Ed Munez was mayor of Kenner, seeing him about 2 years after Katrina and talking to him, and he said the population in Kenner is the same as it was before Katrina, but it's a totally different population.
Yeah. And in fact, the hub of the Latino immigration has been in Kenner and in Metairie, actually, which I don't know that everyone would think of Metairie.
There's a Mexican supermarket opening on Airline Highway now.
So as you said in your, I think maybe the first segment, it was like Katrina shook the snow globe, and we're seeing where the snowflakes are falling. So Region Redefined, a 6-part series, was it? New Orleans Advocate, it's online. Thanks a lot, Gordon. And talking about continued change for this region, something that remains constant is we really like to eat, but we're going to having new places to go do it. Errol, about new restaurants.
Yeah, this was kind of a surprising article that the New York Times had this week, and we know there's a growth in restaurants, but I think the article pointed out just how much of a growth. And the example they use is in the past week, Magazine Street, the 3-mile stretch of Magazine Street, had 65 restaurants, and they opened up the 66th restaurant, a restaurant named Ivy, and there were huge crowds to go there. And so the article just talks about just the boom in restaurants, and they had a figure in there, and it was based on food critic Tom Fitzmaurice has been chronicling this. Like in 2004, before Katrina, there were 809 restaurants in the New Orleans area. Now there are 1,400, even though the population has gone down. And New Orleans like to eat, but you can't explain it just by that. One, I think restaurants are a good opportunity for people coming into the community. They're a great opportunity for ethnics. I mean, that's one business that an ethnic can go in, that people can want to try out your product right away. And so all these restaurants aren't necessarily upscale restaurants. I mean, some of them are small neighborhood restaurants, but they're really important. But an interesting point is that they talk to some website that measures wealth in the community. And one measure that they use is they claim that you can measure the wealth and intelligence in the community by the ratio of restaurants to citizens. and San Francisco was number 1. New Orleans in 2010 was number 14, and you got to suspect that it's probably emerged since then. And so in a sense, it's kind of a sign of affluence. Now, like San Francisco, there's tourism, which New Orleans benefits from, but the article also points out there are a lot of restaurants that are opening in places which aren't tourist parts of town. And so you have that same kind of growth, and it creates opportunity. Somebody points out, yeah, but a place that's really prosperous, like a Silicon Valley, is manufacturing things that you can export, and restaurants don't do that. But someone else makes the point, in a sense they do when they feed out-of-towners, because, when they're giving gumbo to out-of-towners, in a sense they're creating something, exporting it. But it's very encouraging about the city, and they say in that banks are still willing to finance restaurants. We heard the other day at the office about one of these little pop-up barbecue places that got some good publicity, and all of a sudden is going to open a place on Magazine Street, so they'll make it 67, and it was able to get financing. So a lot of activity on that scene. And if you believe the interpretation of the people that the New York Times came in, it speaks well for the city.
And it's more for both tourists and locals to enjoy with all these new restaurants and different types of restaurants.
That's the point they keep making. It's not just about tourists, because there are a lot of things.
It's for the locals too.
And and also one of the things that I think has been documented elsewhere is that very few restaurants are closing too. So they're opening and they're being successful.
And the business is going there to them. Let's go to you, Stephanie, and talk about David Vitter and his political future. What are you finding out about that?
He's got one, which is, not everyone thought he would forever. This is really interesting. We have the big Senate race coming up for Mary Lander. Everyone's talking about that. And all of a sudden, here we are talking about the governor's race, which is a year after that. Lieutenant Governor Jay Darden, who was actually planning to run for governor, has a website up, and he has a countdown to Election Day. It's 687 days.
2015 for governor's race. 2014 for Mary Lander facing re-election.
So David Vitter, sitting in the U.S. Senate, who a lot of people thought was maybe planning a race for governor, and he polls very well for governor. He's got a real base. He kind of has that conservative flank in the state. People also love to run against him, of course, because he's a polarizing figure. I think most people thought he would just kind of hang out there and see what happened maybe in 2014 if the Republicans would retake the Senate. He had a lot of time, but he has now announced that he will make his intentions known next month, one way or the other. And I think the smart money is pretty much that he will announce that he's running for governor, which makes him the front runner. Of course, Bobby Jindal can't run again. He's term limited. And there are all sorts of other people out there who are trying to raise money and mount campaigns. I think Jay Darden will run anyway, but there are people like the state treasurer, John Kennedy, who may not now, Scott Angel, who's a public service commissioner is a name, Gerald Long, who's in the legislature, people like that may look at it and say, he's the big dog. He'll probably raise most of the money. It'll make it harder for other people to raise money.
So considerations that Vitter has to make then, to make this decision, he could win, he could lose, in what ways?
Right, well he could, if he wins big in a lot of ways, because at this point, Bobby Jindal's gone. He is the dominant Republican in a state that is dominated by Republicans. And, in kind of a quirk of how these things work, he would have so much power that he would probably get to appoint his successor in the Senate. Which is powerful, which means that maybe somebody who might be persuaded not to run against him with maybe a little wink that, hey, don't you want to be in the Senate? You've run for that before. We don't know, because basically the governor fills Senate vacancies, and he can time his departure so that it's him, not Bobby Jindal, and I'm quite sure he would. So it's interesting. I think we're really going to have a sense of how this race will go very soon. It will either, if he doesn't run, a lot of people are going to get in. If he does run, I think the field is going to be paired pretty quickly. And then one of the really interesting things to watch will be Democrats. Yes. Because, again, this is a state that votes Republican. Democrats have had trouble putting up candidates even in statewide races that don't involve Mary Landrieu. And there is an announced candidate, John Bell Edwards, who's a legislator. He's not that well known.
And he's from where?
He's from Amite, and he's the head of the Democratic caucus in the House. And he's well regarded. He's a West Point graduate, but he's really not a big name and in a party that's really struggled. And we have these open elections. So the kind of interesting thing is, is there a Democrat, John Bel Edwards, maybe somebody else, who is strong enough to get a lot of Democratic votes? And in that case, the likely scenario is you have a Democrat versus the most conservative Republican, who would be David Vitter, and someone like Jay Darden, who's the moderate, would maybe be squeezed out, the way, remember, Buddy Roemer was once. This happens in some of these elections. Or if the Democrats don't have a strong candidate, probably a lot of those Democrats would go to somebody like Darden, because otherwise you get David Vitter. So when we have these Republican on Republican runoffs here, the Democrat voters, the party doesn't like it because there's no one representing the party, but the voters become very powerful. And this happened very recently with the congressional race in the northern part of the state. Vance McAllister, the two Republicans, and the Republican who had all the Democratic support won, which was interesting, even though it's a Republican district.
Right.
So we might see David Vitter courting some Democratic friends.
We
very
might.
soon.
It's interesting because all of a sudden everybody really likes Democrats quietly.
Quietly, yes. They kind of need them right now.
Yes.
Thanks a lot, Stephanie. Okay, Dawn, the medical complex on Tulane Avenue, and we're talking about the University Medical Center and the VA. We see it going up. How well is it going up?
It is going up actually very well. And both sides, the University Medical Center and the VA, say they have not run into any construction glitches. There haven't been timing slowdowns. Part of that can be attributed to the weather. There wasn't a threat of a hurricane, there wasn't an extensive period of rain over the summer. They did get a test run with Isaac last summer where they put their hurricane plans and their shutdowns into operation, and they have a whole system for shutting down construction, and they got a dry run, and it's been practiced and it worked, but they didn't have to worry about it anymore this year. The University Medical Center will be run and operated by the Louisiana Children's Medical Center Health Group. They have they had to come up with a new logo. If you're talking about the small changes that will become the big changes, the logo has been approved and created, and now the signs are being made and manufactured. So that will be one of the big changes people see as you're driving into the city from the east. There will be blue and white UMC New Orleans letters on the sides of those buildings sometime probably in the spring of next year. That whole health center will open, the University Medical Center will open in the spring of 2015. The building is actually air-conditioned, being finished. The $40 million imaging system order has been placed for new X-ray machines, CT machines, MRIs. That was a $40 million price tag. Those things will start rolling in and being put together. The timeline for all of this is extensive. The diesel fuel tanks have been received. These diesel fuel tanks hold 250,000 gallons of fuel that cost $1 million to fill. Those would power the facility, the entire facility, for a week should power be shut down. So those are kind of some of the things that are happening there. There are positions open now because the interim medical center is open. All the people from that interim hospital will roll into the new hospital, and then there will be even more jobs available. But there are jobs open now. Anybody who's interested can go to umcno.org to look at what they have. They'll have a better idea of how many new jobs will be in that facility come January of 2015, 4 or 5 months before they open.
How many beds in this facility? Do you
I don't know off the top of my head how many beds in that facility. If we switch over to the VA Medical Center, that's several buildings on that site. The former Pan Am building will hold the administrative part of that operation, and it's getting the old fins on it, so it will look like the 1950s. It is currently housing a few of the people, but will be turned over to the VA from the feds at the end of this month, so they can start rolling in their administrative personnel, their human resources. The new jobs that are already happening there are a medical media group that they never had before. Some, photographers and editors to do medical media pieces for them. So not direct medical jobs yet rolling in out of that hospital, but things happening there.
That's a real psychological boost just to see that, because that building was just getting so run down.
Yeah.
So I think it makes people feel good just to see it
And the
improve.
Dixie Brewery, and
That's
speaking
the
of
other one.
another
That's the other one,
psychological boost, they're still working with the state preservationists on that building for final plans and working on asbestos removal in the Dixie Brewery, but that will be restored and will be the research building for the VA hospital setup. their largest building, their diagnostics and treatment building, which is the building that sits in the middle on Canal Street between South Rocheblave and South Galvez, is getting ready to get its facade. So in terms of that drive along Canal Street and seeing the new project, the look will start changing. The steel portion is up, but the facade is going up. So visually, you really can see both of these centers changing and forming, and that the VA will open in the spring of 2016. So spring of 2015 for UMC, spring of 2016 for the VA.
We're finally seeing cranes in the sky.
There's a lot of them
Exactly.
there, and a very exciting project indeed. Let's go over to what's going to be happening just in the immediate days ahead, and that's qualifying for the spring 2014 local races in Orleans Parish.
Yes, we're right around the corner. Qualifying starts next week. This time next week, we'll know who's running for mayor, city council, sheriff, assessor, all kinds of things in Orleans Parish. People are kind of in the end stages of putting together campaigns, although it's interesting, there's still jockeying going on. We're hearing about polls, people testing some familiar names who haven't really let their intentions be known yet. The biggest news we've had, I think, probably the whole election season happened this week, and that is that the incumbent councilwoman from District C, Kristen Palmer, announced that she would not run for re-election. She said she got together with her family. She's got 3 young daughters, and they decided she wanted to spend more time with them. And, you know, those are the conversations people have over Thanksgiving, so that certainly is possible. She was also facing a difficult re-election. She had a challenger named Nadine Ramsey, who's a former civil court judge, and she actually ran for mayor against Mitch Landrieu. Didn't put up much of a campaign and didn't even have to run any campaigns when she ran for judge because she was unopposed. So this is her first big campaign, but she has been putting it together, raising money, organizing. She's been very visible. She's got some support from, you know, other elected officials. One of the things driving that, I think, is this is the district that includes Algiers. And, you know, these New Orleans elections sometimes turn racial, or there's a racial subtext. I think in the city council, which was always majority black before Katrina, has been majority white really since Oliver Thomas left. And there has, you know, been an effort in some circles to try to return the council to some balance given the population of the city. And African American candidates have had some real success in Algiers in recent elections, in the school board, the courts over there. And the district is 58% black. So Nadine Ramsey is African American and Kristen Palmer is white. So I think it might have been an unpleasant election for her.
Difficult one.
Yeah.
Cynthia Hedge Morell, is she term
She
limited?
is term limited from her seat in District D, but she's planning to run for the at-large seat that Jackie Clarkson is vacating.
Okay.
And she's got a couple of possibly strong opponents. One is Jason Williams, who's an attorney.
Can I interrupt one
Sure.
sec? This is the first election where we have the 2
Right.
distinct at-large
Right.
races,
Right.
so that's a
You
It
declare
is.
for either one or
Right.
the
You
other as a
do.
candidate, and then as a voter you vote.
Right, so
Exactly.
Stacey Head is running
Yeah.
for re-election in the one, and Cynthia Hedge Morell
Right.
is running for the
Right.
open seat.
And
And
so-
people are now declaring against either Stacey Head or Cynthia Hedge Morell because they're the 2 kind of virtual incumbents.
Right.
So we will be seeing the slate of candidates finalized by when again? The end of qualifying?
Friday.
End of the day Friday, next Friday.
Okay, all right. We'll be looking for that.
Okay.
Gordon, we have a new U.S. attorney. Now, he's been sworn in actually twice.
Yeah.
He was sworn in about 10 weeks ago, but
Yeah.
then he had the more public swearing in recently, and that's
Right.
Kenneth Polite.
Yeah, it was quite an event. A lot of pomp and circumstance, about an hour-and-a-half ceremony yesterday that what I didn't realize was going to be so elaborate when I went, but it was sort of had the feeling of a coming out party for a politician. This is a guy who most of us don't know very well, but he has sort of a remarkable resume and life story. He grew up in the lower Ninth Ward. He got a scholarship to De La Salle. He got a scholarship to Harvard. He went to Georgetown Law School. He was a federal prosecutor with the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York, which handles a lot of the Wall Street crimes and so forth. Worked for a very famous white shoe law firm up there, and then returned to New Orleans about 3 years ago to work for Lisco and Lewis. And so you got the sense of this thing that this is a guy who's it had the feeling more of a political event almost than a swearing in. Like, this is a guy who I think is going to be running for something when he's probably got 3 years plus as U.S. attorney, assuming we will have a new president. Mm-hmm. We don't know if it'll be a Democrat or a Republican, but assuming his term comes to an end, then I think you'll see this guy running for something. And I would think he's going to run I mean, we'll see how things go in the next 3 years, but he seems like a guy who has very big ambitions. He's only 37 years old.
And there were a lot of politicians there, right?
Oh yeah, every politician. I mean, anyone
Eric
you could think
Holder
of
was
was
there.
Eric Holder was there, the
Attorney
mayor
General.
was there, Mary Landrieu was there.
Attorney General of the U.S. was there,
Yes,
for
it
him,
was-
and speaking very highly of him. And so, what is the focus that Mr. Polite sort of says he wants to emphasize?
Well, so the big change he's announced, and it's a change that's already been sort of happening before his arrival, I would say, but he wants to put more of their resources into fighting violent crime. And so he says he's going to do this without decreasing the traditional focus on public corruption, but he really feels like murder and violent crime are the scourge of the city, and he wants to really aim the office at that. And that office has been doing quite a bit of that in the last couple of years, with working with the local DA and largely in bringing these multi-defendant racketeering cases against accused gang members who have been involved in violence. And they've indicted something like 75 or 100 accused gang members who have been allegedly involved in violence.
But he really wants to fight crime through education too. He
Oh
speaks
yes, I'm
very
sorry.
strongly
That was a
of
big
as well.
theme of the. He seems to want to do a lot of outreach, and he really. This is where he sounded a little less like our prior U.S. attorney, who talked mostly about law and order, and he really talked a lot about. He challenged everybody in the audience to get out there and
To work with
volunteer
youth.
in a school
Yeah.
and that kind of
And
thing.
he had a lot
And
of students. There were public students.
he invited students from all over the region. There were students from 30 schools there. He had the ceremony at Cohen.
So he has a
College
big
Prep.
community outreach focus
Yes,
too.
yeah.
Thanks a lot, Gordon. We're going to take a look now at what's coming ahead. Errol?
Well, a guy named Leo Watermeyer, whose self-appointed mission in life is to defend Armstrong Park, has been making the point this week that the leaves do change here too, that you don't have to go just to New England. And he sent out some photos of what's going on in Armstrong Park in terms of the flora, and there's a couple of them. If you just go on, and then and this
Well,
one.
it's a touch of
It
autumn
is.
there,
But
absolutely.
this is the one that
And we have to
illustrates it the
appreciate
most.
that.
Here's the cleanup
The
guys
golden
picking up
leaves.
the golden leaves, and so the leaves are
Thank you,
changing.
Leo,
They're
for
also
bringing
changing
autumn
in
to
City
us.
Park too. They want you to know
Gordon,
that too.
let's get to you.
Well, going back to the politics, I think we might see Austin Badon get in the sheriff's race based on this poll that was released this week.
So we'll know that next Friday.
We'll know that next Friday.
All right, Don.
It started a few years back as a tiny little holiday parade, but the Downtown Development District has the Crew of Jingle Parade tomorrow at 1 o'clock, starting at Howard and Carondelet. It will be cold, but it is
But
seasonal.
it's Christmas time.
Exactly.
Holiday time. Stephanie.
Okay, the other big hospital story in the region is what's going to happen to the two Jefferson Parish public hospitals. There are public hearings coming up next week and the week after. Monday on the West Bank, a week from Tuesday on the East Bank.
Okay, we'll be looking at that. Thank you, all of you, for being here with us. Thank you for being with us. We hope to see you again next week on Informed Sources. Have a good evening.